What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back with yet another discography ranking. It's been a couple months since I did the Gojira ranking, and here we are in April, and it's time to get to the next ranking for 2025, and this time I am talking about all albums, all 15 studio full-lengths from German thrash metal legends Kreator. Yeah, this has been another one that's a long time coming because, after all, can't do Sodom without doing Kreator, right? When it comes to talking about German thrash bands and ranking them. I know eventually Destruction will probably get a ranking in the future, but that's not anytime soon. But regardless, here I am talking about Kreator. So, my history with this band. So, this kind of goes back to when I was first getting into thrash back in like late middle school, early high school. Like, I was already into, Metallica and Megadeth, and then eventually discovered bands like Slayer and Exodus, Testament, all those bands. And then eventually, as I was becoming more familiar with thrash, I checked out some songs from Kreator, and I really liked what I heard, and then I discovered more songs over the years, as well as the more recent output. And also going back to listening to, like, Pleasure to Kill, for example, as being, like, the big one everybody would talk about. So, and of course, finally going through all these albums. And, well, apart from one particular period, this was pretty fun to go through all these albums. But without further ado, let's get into the history of this band. So, Kreator formed in 1982 out of Germany, originally known as Metal Militia, then they changed their name to Tyrant, and then eventually to Tormentor. And their original lineup consisted of guitarist and, at the time, backing vocalist Mila Petroza, drums and backing vocalist Jürgen Ryle, otherwise known as Ventor, Roberto Fioretti on bass, and original frontman Manny Rayberg. So this was the original lineup of, at the time, Tormentor, and this lineup would be together until 1984 when they decided to change their name to Kreator. And of course, as far as like their big influences, they were really into like the classic metal stuff like Maiden and Priest, but also into like the more underground raw bands coming up at the time like Venom and Bathory, but also lots of love of Bay Area thrash like Metallica and Exodus. So basically, and as well as like punk bands like Bad Religion and Discharge, just kind of all into one melting pot, and that's how Kreator's sound became to be defined. So pretty much after they decided to change their name to Kreator, Manny Rayberg would end up leaving the band, leaving them as just a three-piece with Mila, Jürgen, and Roberto. And they would actually do a couple of demos initially under the Tormentor name before doing a demo or two for Kreator. And eventually they would actually make such a big noise in the underground that they ended up getting signed to Noise Records. And they would actually get to go into the studio in 1985 to work on their debut album, and released October of 1985, we get their debut album, Endless Pain. This is my number 6 album. I think this is a very underrated thrash debut, and it doesn't get brought up as much in comparison to other Kreator albums because this is a pretty raw, nasty sounding album. It was produced by Horst Mueller, who most known up to this point for working with bands like Celtic Frost and Sodom, like their early EPs and such. And so this was the guy to do the production on this album. And musically, while it's thrashy, it's also considered a first wave proto black metal album. Like, there are moments on here where the Venom and early Bathory influence really comes out, but mixed in with those Exodus and Metallica influences. And musically, I think this album's pretty fun, but what makes this album unique is how the vocals are split between Mila and Ventor. Like, Ventor would do like the odd number songs on the track list while Mila did the even number tracks, but the big standouts for me would be the opening title track, Endless Pain. It's just pummeling with a lot of energy. Total Death, where you get like Mila's early like black metal vocals, but almost sounds like they were kind of paying homage to Exodus a little bit, particularly the song Strike of the Beast. The song Tormentor, that's kind of like an early first wave proto black metal staple track. Flag of Hate, it's aggressive and ferocious, like basically a precursor to how they would evolve on the next album. And the song Cry War, you get like this big mid-tempo stomper with lots of thrashy tremolo riffs. And overall, it was just a fun track to really bring this album all together. And also, fun fact, this album was recorded in just 10 days. So, almost nonstop for 10 days working on this album, but it came out pretty well, even though the production definitely has its quirks, and there are times where the mix, like, as far as, like, the instruments not being completely in sync at times, but that adds to the charm of it. It's just three dudes just getting together and thrashing out as much as possible, and for those reasons, I give this album a number 6 rating. So, as they continued on for a little bit, heading into 1986, they actually did get a second guitarist for a brief period. They would get Michael Wolf, formerly of Sodom, who was only in the band for a couple of years prior to joining Kreator, but he only lasted a few days, so they just went back to being a three-piece. And pretty much almost immediately after Endless Pain came out, they went right back to the studio, only this time they got to work with the legendary Harris Johns, who up to this point had only been notable for working with Helloween at this time. And this album that we're about to talk about, it's gonna be fun. Came out April 1st, 1986 on Noise Records. We get the monumental sophomore effort, Pleasure to Kill, which, fun fact, I don't know if you guys can see it, but it's my back patch on my battle vest, because I do love that album. But anyways, this is my number 1. It was kind of a toss-up between this and what my number 2 ended up being, but I put this one at number 1 because this is the Kreator album that everybody should know. It's also one of the most brutal thrash metal albums of the 80s, and this came out during arguably the golden year of thrash, which was 86, because you had so many classics that we all know about that I won't mention in this video, but do your research. But this album was set to be more aggressive, faster, and heavier. Dare you could say this was almost like a proto-death metal album because of just how gnarly and brutal it gets. And also this album, Milla's doing more vocals. Like Ventor only does vocals on 3 songs, Death is Your Savior, Riot of Violence, and Command of the Blade, which all 3 of those songs are killer. Death is Your Savior is like a proto-death metal classic, even though it's still very thrashy. The proper opener after the choir intro, Choir of the Damned, I think, and then it goes into Ripping Corpse. It is a brutal, high-energy track. Riot of Violence has one of the catchiest riffs I've ever heard in thrash. I mean, really top to bottom, this whole album's amazing, but just some of the other standouts, like The Pestilence, which was their first big, long song. It's like 7 minutes. Killer gallops and riffs on there. It's just, this album is just so brutal and nasty. And even the triplet chugs and the breakdown on the song Carrion, it's like chef's kiss. Mwah. This album, top to bottom, I think is perfect. Even though some people complain about the production, I actually like the production being as gritty and insane as it is, because it just adds this extra layer of brutality on top of the album. So for me, this is a stone cold thrash metal classic, very influential to death metal, obviously. And yeah, that's why this ended up being my number 1. So we move forward in time a little bit, and we get a little bit of a longer break between albums, as Endless Pain to Pleasure to Kill, that was what, like 6 months, probably, like a 6-month break in between, whereas this time we get about almost a year and a half break in between albums. And for this next album, they would actually finally get a second guitarist on the studio albums. They would get Georg Tritz on lead guitar in particular, while Milla would focus primarily on rhythm and vocals. So this would, This would be the first Kreator album with two guitarists playing in the studio. And this time they would get Roy Rolland to come in to produce, and released September 22nd, 1987, we get Terrible Certainty. This one fell to my number 7. This was one of the bigger drop-offs in the ranking for me, but don't take that as an insult, because this is still a great album. It's just a little bit different from Pleasure to Kill. Honestly, I would argue the recording quality itself's grittier than Pleasure to Kill, but the mix is a little bit more balanced. And also, musically, this is more or less like straightforward thrash, whereas, like, you know, Endless Pain was thrash, but had some of those, like, proto-black metal, first-wave black metal moments. Pleasure to Kill was more like thrash, but with, like, lots of proto-death metal. This one felt more straight-up thrash. And the vocals get even more wild, as Milla's pretty much taken the helm on just about every song except for one. But yeah, the tracks that really stood out to me, Storming with Menace, kind of a precursor to like where they would eventually go later in their career, where it's thrash but melodic. Like, there's some really cool melodies on this track. As the World Burns, this is the only track on the album where Ventor Jurgen's doing vocals, and the song itself feels closer to American thrash than German thrash, but I love it for that reason, because it just adds, like, hey, they still love their American thrash bands, and they want to incorporate that on this track. But the two big standouts, and the two songs I knew the most from here, Toxic Trace, which there are some nasty chugs, but some really cool guitar harmonies on this track, but the closer, Behind the Mirror, very kind of like almost a bait and switch kind of thing, where it starts off with this like clean guitar intro, before it just unleashes into just a visceral onslaught of riffs and drums. It's just, it's very, very mean sounding even after that clean guitar. It just gets down, dirty, nasty, top to bottom on that song. But yeah, overall, yeah, it's definitely more pushing towards straightforward thrash, less of the early stuff where they were like flirting with the uprising extreme metal sound. But yeah, this was still a great album, even if it's big drop off in comparison to Pleasure to Kill, at least in my opinion, but still great album, just my number 7. So then we move ahead about nearly 2 years later, and things changed kind of drastically for the band. They started somehow getting bigger and bigger in the fan base, obviously because, you know, 3 albums in, and they just keep garnering more fans, also getting to do more tours. And they would end up getting a major label deal with Epic Records here in the States. So kudos, they got a major label deal, at least for a couple of albums. And this time they would actually fly across the pond over here to America to record with Randy Burns, legendary producer, his resume is endless. So good choice when coming over to the States to work with Randy Burns, who's worked on classics. And this album would end up being the final album with Tritz on guitar, and released June 19th, 1989, on both Noise and Epic Records, we get Extreme Aggression. This ends up as my number 3. This was a big improvement from Terrible Certainty, not only in songwriting, but in the production. Like, it's going for a bigger, slightly more polished sound, even though it still has some grit to it. But yeah, top to bottom, this is another very much a classic album in thrash, especially late 80s thrash, when it was starting to shift towards a heavier sound, slightly more technical as well. Like, this album does get a little bit more technical. Like, the title track, it's a fast ripper of an opener. Love Us or Hate Us, this one kind of goes for a bit of a punky vibe. Like, it's very, very punky. Some Pain Will Last. This one's unique because you get little atonal melodies, but also some awesome triplet chugs and gallops. Betrayer, which I think was the big standout for a lot of fans. It's a thrashy ripper with more triplet chugs. And then Fatal Energy, it's just chug city, it's a ripper, gallops, but again, teasing more melody into their sound as opposed to just straight down the line like heft, 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 heavy, heavy, heavy. Incorporating some melody into their songwriting, which is always welcome in thrash, because thrash melodies can be very, very powerful. But yeah, top to bottom, this is another killer offering, and this is easily one of their best, according to the fan base. I definitely agree, and it definitely propelled Kreator to an even bigger level by this point, and yeah, that's why it ends up as my number 3. So on the heels of Extreme Aggression, they would actually get to finally tour in the States. However, there's a bit of a story prior to this tour. So, eventually Tritz would leave the band, and in coming in on lead guitars would be none other than Frank Blackfire from Sodom, because as the story goes, during this like period of limbo between when Sodom released the classic Agent Orange and before Sodom was about ready to tour with Sepultura, about a few weeks prior to that tour, Frank left Sodom to join Kreator, and he kind of left Sodom in limbo, but he got to be a part of Kreator for quite a while, and honestly, huge upgrade in terms of lead playing. Like, Tritz was cool, but he was more or less doing like big dive bombs for the most part, whereas Frank has a lot more to his arsenal. And as a result, they got to play here in the States, doing a tour with Coroner, which that was pretty freaking cool to know that they toured in the same time here in the States. First time ever for both bands playing in the States. Well, Kreator might have done it before, but you get the idea. But eventually they would return to the studio in 1990, and they would once again go back to Randy Burns, and this time Frank Blackfire joins the fold on lead guitars, and released November 6th, 1990, once again, Noise and Epic Records, we get Coma of Souls. This ends up being my number 2. It was close to taking the number 1 spot over Pleasure to Kill, but the nostalgia I have for Pleasure to Kill kept it at number 1. But musically, Coma of Souls is a masterpiece. This is a thrashterpiece. Forget masterpiece. Thrashterpiece. Much bigger, more polished, but still somehow finding a more aggressive sound out of them, despite, production getting better. And this is arguably the best produced Kreator album of the bunch. And definitely with having Frank Blackfire come in, the leads got better, they got more melodic, they got less about squealy dive bombs and more about melody and shred. When the Sun Burns Red, like starting off with those acoustic clean melodies, and then it just punches you right in the face with furious thrash. The title track, it's a little more melodic again. It's like they keep pushing more melody into their sound, but it still remains very heavy, very thrashy. Terror Zone. This one's really cool because you get more beautiful melodies coming into the mix, as well as like tribal drums. It gets mid-tempo at times, it gets fast at times. Overall, it's a very well-written, dynamic song. My personal favorite out of this one would be Agents of Brutality. Like, I love the build-up where it starts off slow and murky before it just unleashes aggression into your ear holes. And then Hidden Dictator, this one's all over the map. Melodic, it's still fast. You get some awesome guitar harmonies with both Frank and Milla, and even a doomy breakdown, which I don't necessarily associate doom moments with Kreator, because Kreator's all about speed for the most part, but a doomy breakdown on this song, I will take it. That was a really cool moment on this album. But yeah, overall, top to bottom, this is another absolute stone cold classic, especially in early 90s thrash, because really after 1990, you're going to find out what happened. But yeah, this was my number 2. Now, speaking of what happened after 1990, so of course the old adage goes that by the time 1991 came around, thrash was starting to feel stagnant because, groove metal was coming in at this point, and also grunge was becoming the big flavor of the month in terms of mainstream stuff. So bands ended up having to shift their sound because of the growing trends that were going on at this point with groove metal and grunge becoming the big thing. And so Kreator decided to experiment a little bit with what was going on, I guess. However, a lot of people, myself included, kind of look at this as a big mistake on their part because, well, pretty much what follows the rest of the decade, it's a mixed bag of what is going on here. But eventually, they would return to the studio in 1992. This time they came back to America, but this time they would go over to Morrisound Studios and work with Tom Morris as the producer on this album. And released October 26th, 1992, we get Renewal. This one fell to my number 13. Probably the biggest drop off of anything in this ranking, going from 2 to 13. Yeah, and musically, this album shifted more towards groove metal, but you also get some industrial drums on here. And even though you have Jurgen on drums still, the sound of them sounds a little more on the industrial side. And also, like, Milla's vocals shifted more towards, like, punk and hardcore vocals. And, yeah, this whole album was a big, giant misstep. I mean, there are a few songs on here that do stand out for different reasons. Winter Martyrium. There is still some thrash left over on that song, but it's also pretty punky. But that industrial snare that gets hit every once in a while, it does drive me nuts. But the other two songs I think were bigger standouts and were a lot better. Brain Seed and Europe After the Rain. Both of those songs, well, more specifically Europe After the Rain, retains the old Kreator sound, but done with this, like, more almost industrial production. But with Brain Seed, it was like thrashy, but also punky. Almost like a crossover song to a degree. But, oh my god. Karmic Wheel, what the hell was that? I don't understand that song. That song had no business being in their catalog. Yeah, this album was a big, giant misstep, but there's a couple of decent songs on here, so it's not total loss, but it does fall to my number 13. And Renewal would end up being the last album with original bassist Roberto Fioretti, so he would be gone from the band for this album. And eventually, as they would play shows and get ready to record this next album, they would end up being dropped by Noise Records in terms of international, but they were still on there, I think, in America somehow, but they would end up signing a deal with Gun Records. And for this album, actually, we have a couple lineup shifts, not only with Roberto leaving, but you also had Jurgen left the band for a little while. So taking their spots, first on bass would be Christian Spezi Geisler coming in to take over on bass. And then for drums, they would get former Massacre and Whiplash drummer Joe Cangelosi. So these two would come in for this album, and this time it would be produced by Vincent Wonyo? I'm just going to say that, Wonyo. And released July of 1995, we get Cause for Conflict. This one was better. It only went up to my number 12. It's still more so on the groove metal side, although I will say, like, the industrial moments were a little bit less on here, and there's a little bit more thrash going on here, but it's not a whole lot. But there were more standouts on this album, at least. Like, this isn't a bad album, it's actually kind of okay. But there were a few songs on here that I actually didn't mind. Like Prevail, even though you still have some of that groove metal in there, it still does get fast and thrashy. Catholic Despot, it's more aggressive. Like, it kind of harkens back a little bit to their old sound. Progressive Proletarians, again, back to thrash. And then Dogmatic, one of the shorter songs in their career. It's maybe 90 seconds, but it is a vicious 90 seconds. So that song kind of gave you a little bit of hope Kreator was going back to their roots. And then you get the song Isolation. It's 11 minutes of crap, and I don't understand. And even in the production on here, it almost kind of reminds me of Chaos AD a little bit. in the production and even a little bit in the songwriting. Like, I guess they were really into that album at this point, so they kind of wanted to do their own version of it, but try and incorporate their old sound a little bit more. Yeah, it is an improvement over Renewal, but then again, that's like saying mushy peas is better than mushy asparagus. Either or, it's not that great. But yeah, it's an okay album, but it's my number 12. Now, after Cause for Conflict came out, both Joe Cangelosi and Frank Blackfire would leave the band, so that would leave Jurgen Ryle to come back into the band, back on drums, and remain there for the rest of the career. However, for guitars, they would actually get a pretty big heavy hitter, Tommy T. Barron from Corner. Since Corner had broken up by this point, Tommy needed something to do, and of course, he was already friends with the guys from Kreator, so it felt natural for Tommy to join up with Kreator. They would stay on Gun Records for this album. Vincent Wonyo would remain as producer on this album, and released July 22nd, 1997, we get Outcast. This falls to number 14, and this is where we get into the definite period of what is happening here with Kreator. This was pretty much the beginning of their gothic era, you could call it. There's still a lot of groove metal on here. The drums are back to sounding industrial. The vocals, I'll admit, are a little bit better than they were on the previous two. Like, Milla's vocals are kind of going back to how he sounded on Coma of Souls. But musically, this album is just a big mismatch of what the heck. Like, like Black Sunrise in particular, like, that song felt closer to Tiamat than it does Kreator, and even the title track, it's like Alice in Chains, but not as good. And even, like, there's hardly any guitar solos. You have Tommy T. Barron in here, and you didn't let him shine apart from maybe one lead melody here and there, and other than that, it just wasn't much. I will admit the guitar tone is pretty good. I do like the guitar tone on this album, but other than that, nothing really stands out except for maybe two songs. Phobia does have some thrash gallops and even some dissonant melodies. And against the rest, kind of thrashy and punky, kind of like Brainseed off of Renewal. But just, I struggle with this one. I ended up having to skim through a lot of this because a lot of this I'm just like scratching my head like, I don't want to suffer through all this in one fell swoop. So, yeah, I just couldn't get into it, so I ended up skimming through a lot of this because I know for a fact it doesn't get any better. So, there you have it. Number 14. Now, in between Outcast and this next album, they would end up leaving or being dropped from Gun Records, and over in Europe, they would sign a deal with Dracar, and here in the States, they would sign a deal with Pavement Music for this next album, and for this next album, it would be co-produced by both Milla and Tommy, so it was self-produced. Excuse me. And, well, released March 29th, 1999, we get Indorama. This is hands down dead last. You all knew this was coming, and again, it just... why? Basically, that's all I have to ask about this album is why. And I thought, like, Outcast was blah. This is even more blah, and this is where they basically decide to go full-on gothic metal, so much so to the point that even Tilo Wolff from Lacrimosa shows up to guest appear for vocals on the title track, just to say, like, hey, we're a gothic metal band now, and it's like, no, you're not, Kreator. Why? It just... I will admit, there are two songs on here that actually I didn't mind for different reasons. Soul Eraser, you get some gallops, some nice riffs, and even some chug in that song, and some really cool guitar harmonies, but the vocal effects on Milla's voice just ruin it. But the one big standout that I will actually admit was good was the song Shadowland, because it kind of teases where the band's going next. And also, the song has some cool solos. Like, I will admit, the solos are the best part of this album. Like, Tommy finally got to show off more in terms of leads on this album in comparison to Outkast, and he did a good job when it came down to the lead work on here. It's just a shame that the leads show up on this really weird, uneven, blah album at best and at worst. And I'll admit, musically, for a gothic metal band, if this was an album, same with Outkast, if both of these albums were written by a band like Tiamat, I think people would appreciate them for what they are, maybe change around some ideas and whittle things down, but the fact that it was Kreator doing this, it just doesn't compute in my head. And thankfully, this would be the last of their experimental era, because we're going to get back to some good stuff here in just a moment. But after that disaster that was Indorama, Tommy T. Barron would end up leaving the band to do whatever he was doing before Coroner would get back together later in the 2000s. And as far as who they would get as a replacement, they would get Sami Uli Cernino, who came from Waltari and eventually Barren Earth, a Finnish guitarist who has a German background. He would come in to take over lead guitars and remain in the band still to this day. And for this next album, actually this and the following album would both be produced by the everybody's favorite, quote, cookie cutter producer, Andy Sneap. While you say what you will about him now, but I still love what he does. And this was back when Andy was first really getting into the production game after doing music for so long. And for this album, they would actually go over to England to work with Andy Sneap, and released September 25th, 2001 on Steamhammer SPV. I forgot to mention they changed labels for this next album. And they would release Violent Revolution. This is my number 9. Welcome back. Oh, welcome back, Kreator. No more of toying around with industrial groove and gothic stuff. We're back to thrash, but there's an asterisk, because while this is back to thrash, there's little hints of melodic death metal on this album, because by this time in 2001, melodic death metal had pretty much become a big underground phenomenon, and I think Kreator saw what was going on with that movement, particularly in Gothenburg, and thought, you know what? Let's go back to who we were from Coma of Souls on back, but incorporate what these newer bands are doing and see how it goes. And I think, for the most part, this hits on every home front. Like, musically, it's got so much character to it. Like, Reconquering the Throne, that song that opens the album, it was just like a giant statement from Kreator saying, hey, guess what? We're back, and we're back in furious fashion. We're back to thrash, even with some modern musical touches, but still, killer opener, like one of the best opening tracks of their entire career. The title track is this big, chuggy, marching, galloping stomper, all of the same blood. It's a thrashy ripper with a lot of balls, and I like my balls, well, to take care of them, I'm sorry. But yeah, it's ballsy, but there's still like melodic grooves. Like, there's still little bit of touches of the groove metal from Renewal and Cause or Conflict, but they're done more effectively on this album. It's not like the main ingredient. It's just there to kind of change the pace up a little bit. Replicas of Life, this one has some really cool clean melodies that lead into thrashy moments, some groove pockets, melody, harmonies on the guitars. Like, Sammy, I will say, really knows how to play melodies and harmonies quite well. I mean, if you know his stuff in Waltari and especially in Barren Earth, you know he can come up with some awesome harmonies and melodies. And then Bittersweet Revenge, this is like melodic thrash mastery right here. It's like thrashy, but with great melody. And also, even in the production, like, the guitar tones are just punchy on here. Like, honestly, out of the two albums Andy Sneap did production for, I like this sound a little bit more than the next album, even though the next album, production-wise, was killer. And this would end up being the longest album in their career to date at 56 minutes. But it never gets boring. This album is awesome top to bottom. It's just only at number 9 because there were just 8 other albums I liked more. But moving ahead, so they would end up touring quite a lot on this album, and they wouldn't get back to the studio until 2004. Once again, still on Steamhammer and SPV. Once again, Andy Sneap producing, and released January 10th, 2005. We would get Enemy of God. This goes up to my number 8. I think musically it's a bit of a continuation from Violent Revolution, but less Melodeath influence and more back to just straight up thrash. And the production's a little bit more polished. Like, this was around the time when Andy Sneap was really starting to find his rhythm in terms of production. Let me get a drink. But it comes off more aggressive in the production. Despite the bigger polish, it makes it still sound aggressive. There's, across the board on this album, like, the clean and acoustic parts that show up are really pretty, but in terms of like the big standouts, like top to bottom, it's awesome. But the opening title track is another classic opener. World Anarchy, some killer gallops. It's very energetic, and of course breakdowns, because Kreator can do breakdowns just as well as any other band, but in their own way. When Death Takes Its Dominion, some great harmonies, gallops, and killer riffs throughout. Voices of the Dead has somber melodies and some epic guitars. Like, this song almost felt like a precursor to their more current sound, but but done exceptionally well on here. And then finally, The Ancient Plague. You get soaring melodies. It even gets somber at times. Again, more beautiful acoustic parts, but it gallops very well, and there's some awesome, heavy triplet chugs that come along on here. It's just, top to bottom, the comeback run continues and improves on some aspects from Violent Revolution on here, and that's why this ended up as my number 8. So, moving ahead a few more years, so again, lots of touring off of that album, and they wouldn't get back to the studio until 2008. This time they would actually get to work with a couple new people. They would work with producer Moses Schneider, but this album would be mixed by the legendary Colin Richardson. And released January 13th, 2009, we get Hordes of Chaos. This one fell a little bit. It falls to my number 10, but it is still a damn good comeback album. Once again, like, we're just keeping on with this comeback run from Kreator. It's just the only reason it does fall to number 10 is because I wasn't the biggest fan of the production. Like, granted, it sounds grittier than Enemy of God, but, like, the big issue I have with the production on here is the snare. Like, the snare sounds very, very thin, and it just doesn't quite capture the band to me. The snare was the big issue on here. But what I will say that I liked from this more than the last two is it's more compact songwriting, kind of going back to their 80s roots in terms of writing, like, shorter songs. Like, I think this album's under 40 minutes long, so they were able to whittle things down into short, sweet, to the point songs, even though you do get a couple ones that go to 4 to 5 minutes. But, like, the title track, almost psychedelic melody before you get into awesome thrashy riffs, gallops, breakdowns, war curse. It's extra fast and it's extra vicious, and you also get, again, more triplet chugs. Escalation, more chunkified riffs. Like, these riffs just sound mean on this song. Radical Resistance is a big, thrashy ripper, but Demon Prince, while it still has a lot of that old school thrash to it, the harmonies and the melodies on here remind me so much of Iron Maiden, which I know that's one of the biggest influences on Kreator, so it would make sense that you incorporate a little bit of Maiden into a song, and they do it very, very well. No complaints on that home front. But yeah, even though it falls a couple of spots, mainly because the snare sounds thin, but musically, I think it's just as good as the previous two albums. It's just a matter of production. But still awesome despite being at my number 10. Now, we don't get as long of a break for this next album. They would actually get back to the studio at the end of 2011, heading into 2012. And this would be the first of two albums produced by the now legendary Jens Bogren, which his resume is endless. I'm not going to go full on into it. And released June 1st, 2012, and we get a record label shift. They went to Nuclear Blast Records, where they are still currently. So kudos for getting on there. And released June 1st, 2012, we get Phantom Antichrist. This goes up to my number 4. This is a huge thrasher piece of modern Kreator. Like, top to bottom, this album is just filled to the brim with aggression, but it also still does kind of push more melody into the songs, but retains that thrashy aggression that they've had on especially the previous two. Like, the opening title track, thrashy barn burner with some cool, like, double time moments, some awesome harmonies. Like, I'd say definitely by this point, Millet and Sammy really gel together, even though they were really already gelling with the previous 3 albums. But I think here is really where they came together to come up with some great harmonies and melodies. And the breakdown on this song is nasty. Death to the World is another big thrashy ripper with some great chug in there. Civilization Collapse, killer drum intro into some melodies, and it's another thrashy banger with some killer double time. Your Heaven, My Hell, there's again more of those classic metal nods and the harmonies. There's even like some lumbering grooves. It's very sullen at times, but again, some more chug going on with the guitars. And then Until Our Paths Cross Again, sullen, clean melodies, and again, some lumbering movement, but then it does get back into straight up thrash territory. So yeah, while this is definitely a bit of a push towards where they are currently, it still retains who they are. And even the acoustic guitar play on United and Hate's pretty good. Again, the only issue, the snare still sounds a little bit thin, but it's better than it was on Hordes of Chaos. But because all these songs are awesome, it goes up to my number 4. So we move ahead to 2016, where they go back to the studio once again with Jens Bogren to work on this album. And released January 27th, 2017, we get Gods of Violence. This is my number 5. I could almost interchange Phantom Antichrist and Gods of Violence because they're so close together. Although I will argue Gods of Violence definitely pushes more melody, but still, again, it's more melodic thrash than it was on Phantom Antichrist. But still, the songs are just done excellently well on here. Even like the song Hail to the Hordes, even though it's like a big anthem, it's so catchy, it's so great. But the standouts, World War Now, back to a little more of a sinister sound. Like, this song is very sinister, thrasher, but also some little atonal melodies kind of get peppered in, like in a spot here, and a spot there. Oh, right there. Satan is Real is a dark, melodic banger. The title track, and I love the touches on this song with how it opens with the acoustic play, gave me nods to Fade to Black. It was like they were paying homage to Metallica with the acoustic play before it just unleashes back into thrash. Totalitarian Terror, furious as hell, but again, some great melodies. Like, they knew how to balance the aggression and the melody perfectly on this album, I would definitely say. And then the closer, Death Becomes My Light, over nearly 7.5 minutes of beautiful songwriting, like great clean melodies, and then the song itself goes into like Iron Maiden gallops and riffs, but it's like Iron Maiden worship with heart behind it. And even Milla's like low cleans, which are more or less like almost like melodic spoken word, but he does them pretty good on this song, whereas like back in the Gothic era, they weren't really that special. But yeah, top to bottom, this is one of my favorites of the catalog, obviously, as it's in my top 5. But this was, if I did my album of the year list for 2017, this would have been like a top 5 for me. It was so good, and that's why it ends up as my number 5. So, after Gods of Violence came out a couple years later in 2019, Christian Giesler or Spezzi would end up leaving the band after a long time. He was in the band for 25 years, so he was the longest tenured bassist that they ever had, and he would be replaced by Frederick Leclerc, formerly of Dragon Force, on bass, and he's still in the band to this day. And this next album, I assume, was originally supposed to be out in like 2021, but due to the pandemic, they ended up having to delay it for a little bit, but they managed to get it done, and this time they would get Arthur Risk to do the production on here, which, of course, his resume is endless. And released June 10th, 2022, we get the latest album, Hate Über Alles. I actually reviewed this one, and this actually did end up on my year-end list. However, going back to it, while it's my number 11, just because, again, the 10 albums above I just like more, but this is still a really good album. However, I will admit, in hindsight, I probably was too generous in the review. This is still really good, don't get me wrong, but this definitely pushes more towards like epic melodic territory than even the previous few. And like even some of the choruses, like it's just basically saying the song title, which initially I liked, but now going back, they fit more for concerts, not so much studio albums. And like the one song that I thought was kind of weak on here was Crush the Tyrants. It's just an okay groovy song, but all the other songs are good, even if musically it's pushing more towards melody, but you still get thrash all throughout. And like even in the production, it's got heavier guitar tones and it's a little more raw, but the mix I think is more balanced. Standouts, the title track is an energetic thrasher. Strongest of the Strong is an anthemic, energetic song that I still listen to this day on occasion. Conquer and Destroy is another big, like, melodic thrasher. Midnight Sun, in particular, is a unique one. Even though you get some female vocals on there, the tremolo play on that song is just furious. And then the closer, Dying Planet, somehow they write a pretty solid doom metal song. Like, it's very doomy. The riffs are chuggy and heavy and nasty and darker overall. I really think the only issue I have with this album is just that I wish there could have been more heft in a lot of these songs looking back, but still musically, it's very good. I just do wonder for whenever they do their next album that they kind of strip down a little bit on the epic melodies and get back to more aggression. Like, get back to the balance you had on Phantom Antichrist and Gods of Violence, and I think the next album would blow Hate Über Alles out of the water. But, ladies and gentlemen, that does it for my Kreator album ranking. Yeah, this was interesting going through all these albums, even if I skimmed through a lot of that experimental period, because I kind of knew what I was getting myself into, and I didn't like hearing like the first minute or two, and I'm just like, can I just get through this already? That was basically my feeling on those albums. But literally, their 80s stuff, Coma of Souls, and everything from Violent Revolution on, I had a good time listening to. So, what is the legacy of Kreator? Well, Kreator are arguably, out of the major German thrash bands, the most successful. I mean, they were the first out of the big three, if you want to say, with Sodom and Destruction, that got to play the States, get a major label deal, and of course have become a household name to the point where they can headline tours over even Lamb of God, or at least co-headline with a young band like Lamb of God, and just really show to all the kids that are playing thrash now, like, dudes, this is how you do it, you know? So overall, the legacy of Kreator, it's neck and neck with Sodom when it comes to legacy. After all, both bands kind of parallel each other in some way, shape, or form, and Kreator remains a legend and will remain a legend for the rest of time. But anyways, that will do it for this video. What did you guys think? What's your favorite Kreator album? What are your rankings? I'd like to see how you guys feel about all these albums. As far as what's going to be the next ranking, well, the next ranking won't be as time-consuming for me because it's only going to be 8 releases and shorter albums. Next up in June will be Bloodbath. I can't wait to go through all that and talk about some of the best death metal of the modern era. It's going to be a lot of fun. But until next time, thank you for watching, keep your horns high, and your dreams wet.